I'm a legal advisor in the International Humanitarian Law Department at the American Red Cross. Thank you for joining us for another in our webinar series on international humanitarian law. Today's event is a little bit different. Normally, when we talk about international humanitarian law, we specifically speak about it in the terms of the legal framework, such as the Geneva Conventions or international customary law during the time of the Civil War under the Lieber Code. However, today we're going to be going back in time to have a greater historical perspective on international law or anything that governs the ethics of warfare, because that is what exactly international humanitarian law attempts to do: limit the suffering and destruction caused during armed conflict. Today, our topic will be over the Aztec civilization. Our speaker for the event will be Distinguished Professor of History at Rutgers University, Dr. Camila Townsend. Dr. Camila Townsend is the author of numerous books on the history of indigenous groups, including her most recent book, Fifth Son, A New History of the Aztecs, for which she received the 2020 Kundal History Prize. And it also is a fantastic book, so I encourage everyone to check it out should they be interested. So with that, I will pass it over to our speaker to begin our discussion on the ethics of warfare and the Aztec civilization. Dr. Townsend, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Christian. I really am delighted to be speaking to you all. I have to say I was surprised by the invitation, and I first said to Christian what I will say to you, which is that I really don't know anything about humanitarian law. Then he explained what he wanted, and I am indeed a specialist, or I guess I should say in Aztec history and culture. Okay, so I will speak to you in ways that are familiar to me, and then in the Q&A, hopefully we can make all this meaningful and useful in the big picture to you. Okay. So, okay, let us begin. Oh, dear, there we go. So this little guy is was a well-known figure to the Aztecs of central Mexico 500 years ago. His name is Tekpat. It means flint knife, and indeed, as you can see, it's a knife made of flint. His teeth are mother of pearl, and his eyes made of obsidian. They did envision Tekpat, flint knife, as being a living being, almost a divine being. He had a ceremonial role. He went with them to war. One of the 4 calendar years is Tekpat, or flint knife. These knives are found in many archaeological digs, and artifacts like them, I think, have been a big part of establishing the reputation that the Aztecs have amongst us today, that is, of being rather bloodthirsty, frankly, savage peoples. Okay, now, I wondered, okay, what to do with this image, this ubiquitous image. Okay, and when I first began to look into it, the situation actually got worse. Okay. I'm sorry, folks, my keyboard seems to be giving me, here we go, trouble. There we go. The situation got somewhat worse. Okay? Other images that come out of the archaeological digs, even more than the little guy Tekpat, give us a clear sense, or I guess I should say a clear reminder of why the Aztecs have the reputation that they have in the modern world. Okay? This is a rare piece, but it is not the only piece where a flint knife is buried in a human skull. Okay? Now, these, again, are the pieces that have tended to make it to the museums. Images like this have made their way into textbooks. These are the Aztecs we have come to know. Archaeologists could have given us a different picture. The same archaeological sites that yield flint knife and that yield those hideous skulls also yield images like this one of seated figurines. This was a young lady who was found in central Mexico and is now actually in the British Museum. All archaeological sites from the Nahuatl or Aztec world in central Mexico have images like this one, or have little figures like this one with mothers and children. Archaeologists could have given us a different view. So why is it that we know only the one? Perhaps because of the nature of those weapons. Those images are pretty gruesome. Perhaps also, though, some of us came to believe about 20 years ago because we couldn't hear what they were saying. We didn't know much about how and when they used, for example, that flint knife. We couldn't hear full sentences. We couldn't hear jokes. We couldn't hear poems. We didn't know what they talked about, thought about, dreamed about. But in fact, there are plenty of what are called by historians alphabetic sources, that is, full sentences, full text written out, okay, in their own language. Okay. There are dozens and dozens of such volumes that have survived. Some are in Mexico's National Library, and some were taken by the French or by the English during the colonial era and are over in Europe now. Okay. Here's a close-up of a particular page. You see two warrior figures at the top, each bearing a bow and arrow. You can see their names written out above them, and then in alphabetic script, and then below them, those same names in glyphic form. You can see Tekpat, flint knife. This is in the year 1 Tekpat, 1 flint knife, and then here's the year 2 house. Right below it. Okay. The words next to it, if you look closely, are not Spanish words, but Nahuatl or Aztec language words. Okay. What happened was that when the Spaniards arrived in the early 1500s, they taught many young boys, young men, we think not any girls, the Roman alphabet so they could study the Bible. But what those young men did was take the Roman alphabet home and say to their fathers and uncles and grandparents, tell us the history that you used to tell. Sing us the song that you used to sing, pray the prayer. And they would write these down, sounding out the words in their own language. So we do actually have dozens and dozens of texts telling histories, giving prayers that come from before the conquest, before white men ever appeared on the continent. Now, to make the point a little more clearly, I'm going to pause for a moment and actually show you how this works, because I've had the experience of giving talks on subjects related to the Aztecs, and at the end have people say, yeah, but how can we really be sure what those glyphs say? Or, yeah, but you're getting all of this from the Spaniards. And I realized at that moment, I never made myself clear. So I'm going to pause just for a minute. Don't worry, this isn't really a language lesson. Okay? And try to show you what it is that we're seeing. Okay? You have to have studied Nahuatl or the Aztec language, and it is still a living language. There are over 1 million speakers in Mexico today. Right? And then you can read what these words were that they were writing out in the early 1500s, because again, they're taking our letters, the Roman letters, to spell out a Nahuatl word. So piali, hello, tlaxtlaui, thanks, amochtli, their word for a book, or whoops, I'm sorry, guys. Did not mean to do that. Oh no. Oh, folks, I am so sorry. I don't know what's wrong with my keyboard. There we go. All right. Okay. I think I must literally have to get a new keyboard. Okay. So they would take these Roman letters and spell out the words, okay, that they were trying, goodness, I mustn't even breathe near it, huh? That they were trying to convey. Okay. So for example, ni, the word I, ni, we might say N-E-E. Okay. They would write out using the Spanish sound system N-I. Ni mitztla sotla, I love you. Ni kitla sotla inamochtli, I love painted records, or I love books. Okay. So in this way, okay, they could write down freely whatever prayer or history their old grandmother or grandfather told them. So we have dozens of these. Now, on to the subject of war and the ethics of war. The Aztec or Nahuatl speaking culture revolved around war. There is no question, but that is true. That is, these different Alphabetic or city-states, it's a little bit more than a tribe, okay, lived in relative peace with each other through many centuries, but there were periods of warfare. And a young man earned his status through his success in warfare. They put time and energy into the various accoutrements of war. It became a high art form. Here you see a shield made from tropical bird feathers. The feathers had been, cut off the shaft of the feather, and then they used a kind of glue to place them there. And you can see literally it's trimmed with gold. The eye there is gold. Now, there were different kinds of warfare. If you've ever read anything about the Aztecs, you've probably heard of flower wars or flowery wars. The Nahuatl wars is Shochiya, literally flower or flowery warfare. Okay? And this was a kind of stylized warfare. It's almost been compared to the Olympic Games, although more dangerous. Okay? People could die during Shochiya. but they didn't usually. These were sort of mini skirmishes, mini wars that were engaged with neighboring tribes with whom one didn't want a serious war. They could be used to keep the young men in tip-top condition. They could be used to kind of make a political point. You know, we don't want you hunting in that woods anymore. It's our woods. And they, in extreme circumstances, somebody could be taken as a sacrifice victim. And we will talk about that more later. Okay? But again, stylized, the intention was not to yield death. Okay? But there were real wars. There is no question, okay, that sometimes one city-state had it out for another, and sometimes alliances formed against certain city-states. Indeed, that is how the Aztec state rose into being. They had originally been one Tekpat, or one city-state or tribe like any other. And over the course of a century, the century before the Spaniards showed up, by coincidence, they had risen to dominate others. So this could happen. The word poliwi means to disappear, literally. It can, but it is also used to mean to perish. When they said tipoluke, we were disappeared, literally, it meant we were utterly vanquished. We were destroyed. Our people, our being were made to disappear. So it meant a total disaster in which dozens of people were killed, and the others, those who remained alive in a village, were taken prisoner. This was one form of warfare, and it was brutal. Okay? This is a colonial image that kind of, a colonial era image. You can see the Spanish style drawing that kind of illustrates all these different forms of warfare all thrown into one picture. You see just 2 people dead there at the bottom. The rest are apparently going to live through it. Okay? They're wearing their fine art costumes, and their major weapon, as you can see, are these clubs that were, they're hideous weapons, a club that was a wooden club embedded with bits of obsidian, which is a volcanic black glass. So a club with bits of glass. You can see that in general, the women are up on the roof watching and waiting for their fate. Will they be taken prisoner afterwards? But this one woman at the very top center is actually fighting herself, and that could rarely happen. Over in the upper right, you see a child being spirited away, whether that's the father or the parent hiding the child from the war, or the child being taken as a prisoner, we cannot tell. Either would be perfectly expected within the culture. So again, you see here in one image, all sorts of things going on. The occasional woman fighting in a sort of an, if you might call it, a stylized way, and yet you also see people dying. Okay? It's hard just from looking at these images, which is what historians have mostly done up till now, to sort of decide, well, what was going on? Are we mostly talking about flowery wars, or are we mostly talking about poliwi, to literally to die in the sense of to be made to disappear? Okay? Well, it's been hard to figure out, actually, what the answer is. But when we start to look at these Nahuatl language sources, what they wrote in those alphabetic books that I showed you, things become a little bit clearer. First of all, it was the duty of an authority figure, of a chief, of the head of a family lineage, even of a god, to try to keep down the number of lives lost, to try to diminish death. Okay? So that, for example, Moctezuma made a speech when the Spaniards arrived. Okay? He was famous to historians and to people who make movies, et cetera, for making this speech. And because of it, people have thought he was a coward. But in fact, he was just voicing what I have seen leaders voice in all of their historical records, that it was his job as a leader not to let too many people die. So he says to his folks, let the Mexica, meaning let the people hear, we are not their match, meaning the Spaniards' match. May the people be dissuaded from fighting. May the arrows and shields of war be laid down. The poor old men and women, the common people, the infants who toddle and crawl, who lie in the cradle or on the cradle board and know nothing yet, all are suffering. This is why your ruler says, let everyone be dissuaded. Now, just to kind of prove to you that I'm not making it up, that there are plenty of moments in these sources, in these Aztec language sources, where other leaders take on that same responsible tone. I'm going to share with you a prayer to the rain god. You would think this would be quite different, but it sounds quite similar. They're praying to the rain god Tlaloc to send them some rain. The common folk are perishing. With pallid eyes live the babies, the children of all ages, those who totter, those who crawl, those who spend their time turning dirt in their hands, those who live sitting on the ground, those who lie on the boards, who fill the cradle boards. All the people face affliction. Okay? And the prayer goes on to say, if these very ordinary people, even children, are suffering, then we must stop this. Okay? You must give us some rain. Just the way a leader will say to his people, this is not the war for us. Okay. Well, you may well ask me, okay, so we get it that sometimes the Aztecs were fighting these stylized wars where nobody was expected to die, or almost nobody was. Sometimes they were going all out to conquer, to build an empire. We've heard of the Aztec Empire. And we understand now that it's the chief's job to know the difference, right? So a good leader is responsible and make sure never to lead his people into the Poliwi kind of war, only the Shochiya, only the flower wars. But you will say to me, fine, that doesn't sound very realistic. Surely there was warfare in between these two extremes. It can't have been true that it was always a choice between stylized warfare and grim destruction, and that all good leaders kept their people out of grim destruction. Well, if you were thinking that, you're quite right. Okay? There was warfare that fell in between and that left room for the kind of individual abuses that we see right up into modern times. Okay? The Spaniards conquered the Aztecs and imposed a Christian rule right over them from 1521 onwards. So it's hard to find a true images of what their warfare was like before the conquest, outside of those archaeological remains that I showed you. It's easier to come north of Rio Grande and look at what Native Americans in North America were doing, because, as you probably know, the English colonists and the French colonists, and the Dutch, and they all lived side by side with Native Americans for a couple hundred years until the end of the colonial era, when the Indians were pushed to the west. Okay? You may say to yourself, yeah, but those aren't Aztecs. However, the Aztecs were relatively recent migrants from the north. They were, in fact, close relatives of the Native Americans of North America. So what I'm showing you here is an image that's actually famous to historians. If you can read the upper left-hand corner, it says New England. What it is an image of, or a drawing, an aerial view of a battle waged against the Pequots in Connecticut by the Puritans in the 1630s. And what you see in the very center is the palisaded indigenous, whoops, sorry again, darn. Oh, there we go. What you see in the very center is a palisaded indigenous community. And then all these people in the first level around it are Englishmen. And then all around them, if you can see, there's another circle of guys aiming bows and arrows inwards. And those are the Narragansett allies, that is, other Indians whom the English have persuaded to come with and fight the Pequots. Well, what the English did was set fire to the palisade, so that, in fact, the people inside were eventually forced to come out, because the palisade was falling inward, the children were dying of smoke inhalation. And as they came out, the English slaughtered them. The Indians, the Narragansetts, who were waiting around the edge to help fight the warriors, they thought, literally stared in aghast and said over and over to the English, this cannot be true. You cannot be doing this. The quotations that come out of their mouths, written down by Englishmen, are really quite extraordinary. Never in the history of their warfare had it been a goal to kill everybody, to wipe out the whole village. It made no sense to them. what warfare was to them was something quite different. And this was true of those who went down and became the Aztecs as well. It was a question of taking a few prisoners, young men, other warriors, torturing them, and if they died without crying out, offering them great honor. So I'm not saying this was pretty. I'm not saying this was gentle or sweet. Okay? But there was an understanding that you take the prisoners when you will take more than a few prisoners if you must, but the idea is get them, the other side, to give up after the taking of a few prisoners. Okay? They are tortured, perhaps given honor if they don't scream, and they are killed. The women and children were adopted, very often actually sold or traded to another village so that they could be successfully adopted. It would be very hard for a child to grow up loving parents if they had seen the dad kill their own father, biological father, in a battle at age 6, right? So they were often turned over to some other Alphabet or tribe. Okay? But the idea was that the women and children did not die, but in fact became part of the other population. And indeed, that was often the motivation for war. They wanted more uteruses so that their population could grow. Okay? Now, again, lest I be accused of kind of prettying this up, romanticizing anything, I want to acknowledge fully and freely this was not fun for the women and children. And to get us away from pictures and drawings and paintings that can make us feel that this was all so long ago that maybe it didn't even happen, I'm going to show you this early photograph. By early photograph, I mean late 1880s, 1890s. Okay? These are Sioux or Lakota children from the lands just to the north of where the Aztec ancestors had come from. They were here being forced into reservation, and then the children were going to be taken off away from their parents and taken off to boarding schools. I show it to you not by any means to imply that all Indians are the same or that the Aztec and the Lakota are the same, not at all. Of course, they all have separate tribal identities. But again, I do think sometimes that a photograph is worth 1,000 words, and I can offer this to you, to remind me, right, to remind all of us that it was horrific when the children were taken from their families. In this case, they were being taken off to Carlisle Indian School. In the case of the Aztecs and most Native Americans before the conquest, they were being taken off to be adopted by another tribe. I don't want to imagine that we didn't or wouldn't have seen agony in their eyes, okay? But they were not going to be killed. It was the beginning of a new phase of their lives. Okay? Now, back most directly to the Aztecs. Okay? They too, they and the other people who spoke their language there in central Mexico, they'd migrated down from North America, as I said, and there they lived. Okay? Undertaking the kind of warfare that I've just been describing. Okay? When people grew up as prisoners or the women were taken as adult prisoners, they suffered for a while. And it was known that this was the case. The Aztecs were big on music. Here you actually see a colonial era drawing, but of traditional people playing traditional instruments. And some of the songs that have come down to us, again, in writing, the words were written down in their own language by the people themselves in the early 1500s. Some of those songs are in the voice of captives taken in war. And they are sad and angry and sometimes funny. They give evidence of people trying to adjust and yet still missing home. Okay. One set of words from one of these songs includes this phrase, Manose nimiki. It literally means, I would that it were that I die. I would as soon die. Okay? These words are in the voice of a young woman who has been taken prisoner in war. Her people were the Chalcan people. Okay? And she is now living with the Aztecs in their capital of Tenochtitlan. And she represents both women who have been taken in war and also the Chalcans, because there are other Chalcan prisoners of war in the city of Tenochtitlan at this time, because the Chalcans lost the war. And she repeatedly says to the high chief, you must treat us better. The way I am treated now, I would as soon die. Okay, this is cruelty. This exceeds all bounds. If you treat me with love and affection, I will respect you. I can even, she says to him, I will even offer you affection. Here, take me by the hand, she says at one point. Okay? So this is an example of a sort of almost like a political protest song that was sung in the name of prisoners of war. And indeed, the Chalkins were, within a few years of the time this song was sung, which was in the 1470s, within a few years of that time, they were brought to the inner circle and told, you can become an equal with us, the Aztecs, kind of join us in the inner circle of governing other people. So songs like this had an effect. The point is that people in this world knew that prisoners of war experienced pain because they were, even though they were treated kindly and were adopted, they were no longer at home, right? They missed their people and they no longer felt like they were being treated as equals. They were allowed to say that. Okay? But there is, I don't know what's the right metaphor. It's more than a fly in the ointment. There is pain in the heart of this, okay? The system obviously allowed for abuses, and the Aztecs did abuse it. That is to say, over the course of their time of sort of waging war against others and trying to grow their own power, they reached a stage of being much more powerful than their neighbors. They were very clever about forming alliances with the close neighbors. And then they were able to attack other people who lived further out, almost with impunity. And they became, their political leaders, I would argue, did become vicious. This is a tsompantli, a skull rack, that literally shows the charred remains of skulls that were collected after human sacrifice. Now, let me explain. Those prisoners of war that I mentioned to you before were sacrificed to the gods. The idea was that we give the gift of human life to the gods. It is the most sacred gift we can give. But naturally, people didn't want to give their own lives. So what the ancient Native Americans did was wage war and give the individual, or sometimes two, or even at the most three, prisoners of war to the gods. And they, again, received great honor if they did not cry out. They knew that if they lost the next time, theirs would be the blood that fed the gods. Okay? Well, the Aztecs took this to a high art and in fact used it as a political terror tactic. Okay? In order to convince people not to fight against them and to join the empire, they actually sometimes, and we get this from their own writings, again, would kidnap people from the villages they had their eye on, bring them to see these sacrifice ceremonies that, again, were no longer just one or two people, but now were, say, a dozen people. And by the end, several dozen people, okay? Abusive, horrific rituals. Okay? They would let these visitors see them and then send them home. And as one writer said, I think I'm quoting directly, in this way they were undone, in this way they were terrorized. He went on to explain, that way they decided by their own free will to join our Aztec state, to join our empire, rather than fighting us when we came to ask them to join. So it became a terrifying and horrific political sort of club that was used to beat other people. In fact, to such an extent that most scholars would agree that it was because it was considered that they were abusing warfare, abusing the way in which warfare was to be enacted, that they were able to be defeated when the Spaniards came. That is, that many of the people who joined the Spaniards, the indigenous people who joined the Spaniards, did so not because they didn't believe in any human sacrifice. They too sacrificed a prisoner of war here and there, but because they believed that the Aztecs were exceeding what was acceptable, abusing the possibilities. Okay? Even then, though, in the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan, the artists and the singers continued to protest. That is, what they said in their songs is that we should not kill so much, that life is beautiful, that life is everything, that life is what we're all here for. They painted those paintings, they sang those words. They even likened warriors to flowers, the idea being that they are beautiful young people and fragile, the way a flower is fragile. not exactly what we expect the Aztecs to have said. But the world that they lived in was complex. It was hardly the world of savage excess from the beginning of the era to the end, no matter which tribe you were talking about, that we have heard so much about. They did have certain understandings and certain rules that they expected each other to live by. And when they did not, they complained. Okay, right? So now I think I should stop sharing my screen so we can use our last 15 minutes to talk. I imagine that there will be questions, and I have seen that there are things coming in the chat, although I confess I haven't been reading the chat. I find I can't give a talk and process.
Not a problem.
Okay, right.
And I'll get to those in a second. I did have a couple of questions for you. One was just, and maybe if you can correct me if I'm wrong about my own research into the subject, but it's about maybe legal codes and maybe how, because law was much more customary when it wasn't written down before we had codified law. Did the Aztecs have any set of system that kind of documented their laws or customs? And were these pictographs that you were showing, like, could that be an example of that?
They did not. There is no sort of equivalent of Hammurabi's code. There definitely is no Geneva Convention of 1864. That is right. That is and again, keep in mind that almost everything, not just law, and certainly not just the law of warfare, was part of an oral culture. We have these alphabetic texts now because in the early 1500s, they learned the Roman alphabet and started to write all sorts of things down. But the glyphs that they had before were not full expressions. That is, they were just kind of mnemonic devices. Here's a glyph that tells us that in this chart, this is where King so-and-so belongs. Or this glyph tells this village that they should bring 3 bushels of corn as their tribute, okay, something like that. So the full and rich language, human expression, they did not write down. Ever. Okay. No diaries, no letters, no laws of ethics, etc. So everything that we know about them, we are piecing together. It used to be just from the Spanish sources. Now we're piecing it together, at least from what they wrote themselves in their prayers and histories, etc. But no laws and no ethics codes. So in that sense, they are or were very different from modern people. Okay? But they definitely had expectations of self and expectations of each other. It was possible to break the rules.
Okay. My next question was going to be about religious temples. Now, I know that like the many Aztec city-states, maybe they had, a deity that they focused on more than others. I don't know if that's correct, but my question is that during warfare, were those temples kind of immune from destruction by the Aztecs themselves? Or was that just something that was, that wasn't necessarily a norm that was followed?
Actually, the opposite. That is, the temples were not immune. They were even targeted, but not the priests. So here's the deal. It is very much like ancient Greece. You mentioned that. That is, each city-state had a favorite god or goddess. On the other hand, everybody recognized everybody else. So like Athens loves Athena, but they know all about Poseidon and Zeus, right? So same here. One city-state loves Tlaloc, the rain god especially, but knows all about the other gods. However, when they went to war, they almost imagined that their gods behind them were going to war with each other. So if your god, suppose you're from the village of Chalco, which actually was the only village to worship Quetzalcoatl, that famous feathered serpent god. If Chalco defeats the village where they mostly worship Tlaloc, one of their goals in these stylized wars that I talked about, where you don't want too many people to die, but you still want to make your point, was to burn Tlaloc's temple, not the priests, not the people inside, but to show, Quetzalcoatl just came out on top. That is, Chalco just came out on top. So there was no sense that you don't burn a certain building. There was, as I said, a sense you don't kill certain people. You don't kill the women and children or any non-combatants. It was supposed to be between warriors.
Okay. But that was during the conduct of warfare, but they could still take women and children as slaves.
Prisoners. Absolutely right. Now,
So that
again,
was
not slaves like in the US South. That is,
okay.
their children weren't going to be slaves. They weren't going to be treated badly. They were going to be adopted. But it still was not a happy thing to be. And we know
Yeah.
this because of these sad songs. Okay.
Yeah, it was more of a forced transfer or a
forced transfer. And I mean,
Yeah.
the idea is the children seem to have, as you would expect, under a certain age, adjusted very well and would almost forget. The young women suffered more, is the argument, is the understanding.
And then my last question before I open it up to our audience today would be, when it came, we talked a little bit about classification of people that some received, maybe it was between warriors as such. And, you know, in the international legal system and political system now, we have this idea of, you know, diplomatic immunity, that certain heads of states can't be charged for certain things. Outside, they can be charged definitely for international crimes. But before World War II, that was something that was debated. And I was wondering if you could tell me if the supreme leaders of these city-states, or the Tlatoani, were they kind of immune from, I mean, obviously they would be a part of the fight in some regard, but I would be wondering if maybe the opposing force had some type of respect for their position that protected them more than maybe regular warriors.
You know, that's a very good question. And I hadn't thought about it before. My mind is racing through these sources that I know. And I think what you just said does apply. That is, I can definitely think of cases where foreign princes or people from chiefly families were killed. So they were not immune. That is, there was no absolute line around them. It wasn't like an absolutely protected class. No. On the other hand, they weren't usually killed. I mean, very often the Tlatoani, the speaker, the high chief, was there in the end, and it was part of the discussions of what the terms of the truce were going to be, right? And in other words, was it going to be, was there still time to argue for this being more of a flowery war without prisoners taken? You know, if we give up now, can we? So I can think of many instances where the chief is still there making that, and they're not targeting him. So I think it would be true that actually the ones who were killed were most often the ones who were insisting on not forming the peace, that is, not laying down the weapons and continuing to fight. In that case, then the enemy would have been motivated to actually target them, to try to shut that view down and end the war.
Okay.
So
well, thank you for that.
But there are rules around it. I think implicit, again, always implicit rules. They're not codified.
Well, we have some questions in the chat, and I'm just going to go as I see them. But the first one I wanted to ask, and I think this is a very interesting question, especially given that it's about medical doctors, and you know, I would say that there would be some type of holistic medicine during that time period.
Yes.
The question is, were there any special protections for people that maybe worked in a medical capacity, or and I guess I would add on to this, was it expected to treat wounded people because of the fighting? Was that something? And I understand that during a holistic sense with you know, magic and all of that. Was there anything like that within their culture?
Well, there's no direct equivalent to the Red Cross, but right. But one thing that will surprise people is almost all doctors were women. There were male shamans, male healers, and some medical, but mostly it was women. Women were the ones who performed what we would think of as medicine. I mean, certainly they were the ones who bore the babies. They pulled the rotting teeth. They gave, for horrific constipation or diarrhea, they knew which herbs to give, etc. Okay, so I think one could argue that there was some protection, but not because they were medical personnel, but because they were women. Okay, there certainly is discussion in these histories of, you know, after battles, trying to save people, trying to cure people. And I can't remember ever reading a case where that was not allowed, or where the people who were trying to, care for the wounded were themselves targeted. And the only thing even remotely similar, and this is quite different, is that they talked about when the new diseases, when the novel viruses came with the Spaniards, everybody got so sick at the same time that at certain points in the epidemic, they said, even the healers were too sick. There was nobody there to help. So, but I don't remember in any other context ever reading that even the healers, were being targeted. But again, I would argue that may be because they were women, not because, well, I was going to say not because they were there to save lives. I'm not sure though. We can't get inside their heads. They sure believed in saving lives if they could. That is all through the sources in terms of what a chief's value is, in terms of just the value of life itself. So why they were letting the healers do this, whether it was because they were women or because they were healers, I can't say. I mean, we could argue both based on their culture.
Oh, that's really interesting to hear. The next question is, are there examples of friendly behavior or peace treaties with neighbors in South/North America or the Caribbean? I guess so maybe between city states, between the different Aztec city states, were there peace treaties, even maybe between some of the city states and the Spanish, for example, or between other civilizations. David, if you would like to clarify that, please feel free to come off mute. But I think I added a little bit to his question, but yeah.
I'll launch, but David can interrupt if I'm not addressing the question. So before the conquest, before the Spaniards arrived, absolutely there were treaties. And here I can actually offer you the glyphs, pictoglyphs. This is one thing that they did write down, okay, like tax lists, etc. They also wrote it down when different groups of people were getting together and agreeing to share land, in effect. So that's to them what a treaty was, that because they were partly farmers, but they were also partly hunters. Okay? So there are none that survive, but there are some from post-conquest that are said to be, by the people alive who remembered, like the ones they used to do. And they would show the hills and the land formations, et cetera, and show the different peoples and where the different peoples, the different tribes or Alphabetic will be. And the agreement was, we won't fight. And sometimes they broke those treaties. That wasn't a European invention. But they agonized about it when they did. Some of the histories are like, oh my God, we broke the treaty. Now our lives are ruined forever and ever. Okay. So they tried to keep them. Okay. And there's no question that these treaties did work. That's how we end up with nation states eventually. Neighboring groups decide to work together and stop fighting with each other. And then that group grows and grows and grows until we have what we might call a government. And that was happening there too. Now, the question about the Spaniards, quite different. As you know, the English did sign a lot of treaties with different Native Americans, and so did the US government following them, which they then often broke. Okay? The Spaniards, much less so. They did up in the Texas, Florida, Arizona, New Mexico area, but almost never in their main territories. And the reason was, we think, the Spaniards never said, well, this is why we're not signing treaties, but the implied reasons the implicit reason is that they were partly farming peoples. They were sedentary most of the year. So it was quite easy for the Spaniards to come in and kind of decapitate the Aztec government, the preceding government, and say, okay, well, we're the government now, but your village life can continue where it was, okay? But we now rule you, so that this new Spain, as it was called, Mexico, consisted of, the population was more indigenous people than it was Spanish people, very different from the English colonies. So they didn't need to sign a treaty with their neighboring Indians, because the Indians had become el pueblo, had become the people that New Spain consisted of. So just a very different context. Not so much that Spain wasn't interested in treaties, because again, up in Texas, where they were dealing with a very similar situation, nomadic peoples, they signed treaties, just like
Okay. I guess I will open it up for anyone who maybe isn't able to use the chat. Are there any other questions at this time? I guess the one just came in. For the Flower Wars, for the Flower Wars, the 3 city towns would fight one another, and the victor then had a new gene pool and human sacrifices, and they equate it to the Hunger Games, which I haven't read or seen. Right. So I'm going to assume maybe it's
not quite. What you just described actually is more like what I'll call real war, where poliwi was at stake, where perishing or disappearing was at stake. That is, you try to conquer literally to either remove the others from existence in the worst case, or more likely to take as many of their people captive as you wish to enlarge your population and to scare them away so you can use their hunting grounds, et cetera. Sort of that middle ground war that could be stopped as soon as the other side said, never mind. Okay. But the Flowery War was more like, again, like a scary Olympic Games, that they would be agreed upon, that the two sides would agree, we're going to have a flower war now. And if in a really bad fight, somebody might actually be taken prisoner as a sacrifice victim, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was more skirmishing, to keep people on their toes, to keep people drawing and painting and making those beautiful shields, et cetera. Okay. Kind of a kind of symbolic way of almost muting war. We're not going to have a real war. We're just going to sort of have like a brutal boxing match where somebody could die, kind of. So what you described existed, but it wasn't the Flower Wars. Okay. I will let you read it, Christian, because the chat comes up so quickly, and then I don't want to start messing with my keys because something's wrong with my keys, as you saw.
Has anything popped up in your research that really surprised you, or that maybe the modern mainstream academic system or just thought on the Aztecs in general, like the public isn't aware of? Has anything really surprised you? What has stood out in your research on the Aztec civilization in particular?
I would say the thing that stood out the most, that surprised me the most, actually, was, now this might seem ironic, but how unviolent they were compared to their reputation. They strike me in the sources as being just like other peoples, certainly like culturally like the other Native Americans. They have a rich sense of humor. They love a surprise. They talk about getting angry at each other for kind of reasonable reasons. Okay, so it struck me often that it was a lot like reading, say, medieval European history, and I didn't think that they would turn out to be brutal savages, but I did think that I was going to come across sort of a deeply alien culture, and I didn't find that. With this exception, one could argue, at the end of the Aztec rule, when the political leaders were literally, I think, going off the deep end. But we can all find examples of states or countries that have behaved rather well over time, and then at a certain point, certain leaders get into power and brutal, horrific things happen. So for me, that period didn't unsay everything else.
If you don't mind, if we have time for one more, and then if we don't get any, maybe I could pass them to Dr. Townsend. But if you have a second just for one more question, I know we're over time. Is that okay?
Sure. I'm just trying to read the chat, but I can't, so I'll let you do it. Sorry.
Well, there's one that says, and I'm interested in it too. Is there anything to be said about how captives were treated after taken prisoner and before sacrifice? So maybe there were some customary treatments, like maybe because they were being sacrificed for religious reasons, maybe there was a better treatment maybe for those prisoners that were captured in war before that, or was it like a punitive treatment?
It was not. And in fact, the ones who were destined to die in those horrific ceremonies were treated like princes. The exotic, most marvelous food. I guess one could argue this is a little bit like the Hunger Games, right? In the movies anyway. That they were given, if they were men, they were given beautiful young women to sleep with, to put in luxurious apartments, fantastic food, etc. Hey, the idea was, live life to the fullest now while you can before you make this great gift to the gods. Okay. Mm-hmm. There were occasional situations where a prisoner of war was humiliated, but it was very rare, and there would be very specific situations. And even then, what they considered humiliating is not necessarily what you might be imagining. Like there's one story that's repeated several times, so I think there's a kernel of truth to it. The princess, the highborn chief's daughter, is in a sort of a wooden cage. I mean, these are not tiny cages, but she's being held as a prisoner. And she doesn't know whether she's going to be adopted or if, because she is the high chief's daughter, if she's actually going to be sacrificed. And she begins to rage at them that they shouldn't wait so long. Give me the chalk and the feathers, she says. I mean, that is the ceremonial chalk and feathers before they are to die. I want to die. I want to go to my gods. I want to show you how brave I am. don't keep me waiting here. Don't humiliate me like this. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that they considered that humiliating, but again, we don't mean that they're wearing, being put in dog collars and dragged around the room or anything like that. I've never come across that. That was sort of against the whole point. The whole point was to please the gods, not to do something horrific.
And then one other question was about the evolution of warfare. In your book, you kind of begin with talking about the bow as a technology that kind of impacted the Aztec civilization. And the question is about maybe, was there any type of evolution in warfare related to weapons technology or maybe philosophy through your research? Did you see a change in how the Aztecs viewed warfare as technology grew, for example? Maybe some technology was off limits to them?
Yes, now it's a little tough because although we have all these sources, they were all written down in the early 1500s. They talk about earlier eras. And I think for the generation or maybe two generations before the moment when they were written, we can largely trust them. When they talk about things that happened 100 or 200 years previously, I think we have to assume that it's more myth history because they can't, none of us can be sure, right, what happened.
Yeah.
Now we can because we got printing presses and we got internet sources, right? But so I can't say with certainty, but what I do gather from that sort of time period that we can see is that they developed a philosophy in keeping with their military might that would shore up their sense of themselves as virtuous. We've seen other states do this too. So these political leaders wanted more power over their neighbors. And as we know, they upped the number of sacrifice victims and brought people there to scare them, et cetera. They also, again, gleaning what I can from these sources that were all written in the early 1500s, it seems to me that there's evidence that they were developing a philosophy that they had to feed the gods, not just one special gift, but dozens of people, on a certain day of the certain month, and that the next month the other god demanded this. Nothing like that seems to come from the earlier period. So it's like they're inventing a philosophy that will help them believe in their military terror campaign. And again, I think we can look at other, European history, even US history, to see other examples of that.
Yeah, finding a justification for
right, a way to feel virtuous, even though what you're doing, is wrong. And I would argue they knew it was wrong because of these protest songs. I mean, there were songs that were still in circulation in the 1500s talking about how it was wrong.
Well, I mean, the last question is about, was there any collaboration amongst the city-states, let's say, to preserve life? And this is not necessarily about warfare, but maybe the instances of widespread diseases. And then the other part of the question is, was there widespread disease, pandemic or epidemics prior to Spanish arrival?
Right, I'll take the last part first. So actually, no, they had, a few common colds, et cetera. And in the Caribbean, it is thought that there was syphilis, because it is thought that it got to Europe through Christopher Columbus's venture. That is, that they kidnapped a few indigenous women, all of them raped the same girls, so they all got this syphilis, and then they spread it through the European ports where they landed. But other than that, archaeologists, and certainly in these written sources, we find no evidence of mass disease except from malnutrition. That is, say, scurvy-like symptoms in times of drought. And you might think, well, why would that be? It was because they weren't, most of them were not farmers. Most Native American peoples were not farmers, they were hunters, so they didn't live with their animals. Even those that became farmers, the corn, beans, and squash people, like the Aztecs, did not domesticate animals except for the dog. So you don't have the situation that the Europeans and the Asians had of living with animals. And as we all know, it's some virus changes in some species of animal, and then with contact with human beings, we are all faced with a novel virus. That's how the Europeans and Asians developed such a menu of viruses. And that wasn't happening in the New World, which is why they were then so vulnerable when East meets West, when the Old World met the New World. These were all novel viruses to them. And they talked about that in the sources, that, the days of everybody dying from a certain sickness, literally sometimes 20 to 30% of the people in the case of certain smallpox outbreaks, that was completely new to them. Okay. So that was just not something they were used to. Now, there was a first part of that question, which I have lost. What was it?
Was there any collaboration,
Right,
amongst the
right.
city-states to preserve life?
To try
and
to
it was
save
in
life.
reference to the disease, but yeah.
And so it didn't happen because of disease, because they didn't have that problem, but it did in times of starvation. Now, the way they did it will horrify us in modern times, but it was effective. What they found was that one way to save children, if your own village's children were dying, you could not convince the neighbors to just feed the whole village. The people of 100 miles away who didn't have a drought, you couldn't convince them to give you all their corn and beans, but they would take the children. Now, those children grew up as, you will say, slaves, and indeed that is true, although they were adopted. I mean, but maybe they were the child in the family that had to do all the sweeping. I don't want to pretend that they were adopted as, say, the beloved son and heir, although they might have been. Okay? So yes, there was a sense that we must save the children, but the way that this was done was by literally having merchants take them to the neighboring villages where they were accepted, okay? and they lived to tell their story in middle age. But it's not what we would wish for in modern times, but still better than an understanding that on the part of neighboring regions that we should just let them all die.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're over time, and I don't want to take any more time from you, but I really appreciate you sharing your expertise and knowledge on this subject. I found it fascinating, and I'm getting lots of comments from other people privately in the chat that they appreciated it as well.
Well, I'm very grateful that you're interested, especially since it isn't directly relevant. You're asking yourselves to think big, sort of, and appreciate human choices in the large scale, and that's really something.
Yeah, and that's what we're trying to do, to take not just make international humanitarian law something that's for lawyers and those having to speak legalese. It's a part of our human story, because war has been a part of our human story as well. So it's important to have these historical perspectives in the back of our mind when we talk about it. So thank you again. Everyone, Dr. Townsend's book's The Fifth Sun, A New History of the Aztecs. It's fascinating. I gave some copies for Christmas, so it makes a great gift as well. So I just encourage you to pick it up and read it if you can. So thank you again. Everyone, I'm putting my email in the chat should there be any questions. I'm also putting our webinar website as well. And again, thank you again, Dr. Townsend. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your kind comments in the chat. I appreciate it. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.